Welcome to the Tech Unlock podcast, where we demystify emerging technologies and give you the keys to unlock your successful tech career. I'm your host, Grace McJones. Let's unlock the future together. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Tech Unlock podcast. Today, we're talking about a topic that I feel like everyone has heard about. It sounds like a buzzword, but there's a lot of, I would say, inside information fun that comes with it. And who other than to have than a AI expert on the show? So, welcome to the show, Seth. I'm excited to have you here to demystify prompt engineering.
I'm really excited to be here as well. It's a really fascinating topic, and what's cool is that for me, the thing that's been most interesting is that like everyday people started asking about AI topics that were quite complex, and I couldn't be more delighted about it.
So, where were you when you first heard about OpenAI Chat GPT? I know you already work in tech and you probably had an early preview, but do you remember what you were doing, where you were, and were you like, wow, this is groundbreaking, or were you not that impressed?
So no, I think for me, the thing that hit me because the technology I had heard about, right? Generative AI had already been around for just a tiny bit, but the thing that surprised me the most is some people use Facebook generally for family and friends kind of thing, and then they have their outward. And so what was surprising to me was people on Facebook that I went to high school with were all of a sudden talking about technology that I kind of work on a little bit, and it was surprising because the stuff that they worked on was not even adjacent to this kind of tech. And it's not complicated, but it's quite sophisticated technology. And so I remember the day when someone on Facebook was like, hey, I'm using Chat GPT for blah blah blah, and I'm like, wait, what? uh all of a sudden something that to some had been esoteric just sort of dived in the mainstream, and it was pretty excited. I was pretty delighted by it. I was like, wow, this doesn't happen very often, with the stuff that we work on.
I similar Instagram. I was like, wow, like other content creators who created content about several things. I'm like, wait, how do you know? And so
Yeah,
that's the beauty of technology that's readily accessible to so many people. It's like you don't have to learn how to code to do this. It's like once you know the basics, you kind of have what it takes to get started. And so there is kind of like a differentiator when we talk about prompt engineering in general, which is kind of like, words that you feed into this generative model versus like AI prompt engineering. So what is the difference? If people are like, okay, is it just kind of like, I'm just spitting words and telling it to just give me information? Or how can you break that down for us for people to get a more simplified understanding of what that means?
yeah, absolutely. One of the misconceptions about these particular models is that they somehow are databases, or that they have fundamental knowledge of everything, or that it can reason about like humans do. But the reality is that these models are primarily designed for language completion. And so they are language models. The reason why they kind of captured folks' imagination is because they were so good at it. They were able to complete things. And so, just to give you a little primer on what these things do, Chat GPT in general is GPT 3.5 Turbo, is what we call it internally. What it does is it takes 4,000 tokens in the prompt. And now a token, just think of it as a piece of a word. Like, for example, the word don't, DON apostrophe T, is broken up into 2 tokens because that makes the vocabulary set a little bit smaller. Instead of having to have the vocabulary of all the words in any language on the internet, you can separate it into like tokens. So DON is 1 token, apostrophe T is 1 token, can't, the apostrophe T is the same token, CAN is a different token. And so it takes 4,000 tokens. And what it really wants to do is it puts those in the model, and it really wants to give you the next likely token, which is, again, another piece of the word. And so if you're ever playing with Chat GPT, it's not typing and it's not thinking. What it's doing is it's giving you each token, but in a loop. And so you get the 4,000 tokens, it spits out 1 token. It puts that token back in the stack, or at least the software does. It sends it back to the model. And so it looks like beep, 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 beep. It's like it's typing, but it isn't. It's just doing it in a loop until it reaches the stop token, which says that's the end of the thought, or you reach the max token length that you can specify in the models. So that's what's happening. Every time you chat with Chat GPT, it is sending that into the model. It's typing responses. What Chat GPT does is it takes the context or the history of your chat, and it also gives that into the model, and it puts it in the prompt. And so Chat GPT is already doing prompt engineering on your behalf by sending it your question, the chat history, and so that it can complete the next thing. And then they build a nice little facade over it to make it look like it's chat, but it was trained over chat style data, so it's very good at doing chat completions. And so that's what you're seeing. And I know that takes all the mysticism out of it, but once you
Yeah.
understand what's going on, it becomes clear why these things are so cool and can actually revolutionize the way we do stuff.
Yeah, no, I love how you basically took the veil from like how it works to like, oh, not saying that it's more boring, but it's like, oh, so this is how this works. I use tokens and it's not really saving my data to like train it. It's more
Mhm.
about predicting what the next token is going to look like, which a lot of people don't know because that information is not really shared most of the time. So thank you for sharing more about that. So
Yeah.
now when it comes to, what a prompt engineer does, what does that look like? I know this can differ from person to person, task to task. I recently saw that a company, I think it's called Anthropic, has a job position for AI, no, a prompt engineer and a librarian, and the pay is around 250 to
Oh, wow.
300K. And I
That's
was like,
amazing.
wait a minute, okay, like what is this job description? And obviously it's an emerging field, but from your perspective, like what is, like the job description for like a prompt engineer, and what skills are required to be a good one?
That's a great question, and in fact, it's a very useful and probably time-consuming job, because
Mm.
now that we know that what happens is you are creating some text, sending it to the large. When I say LLM, I mean large language model. ChatGPT is an example, but there's other ones. Meta has one called Llama that has 70 billion parameters. It's also available.
Wow.
Anthropic has a couple. There's one called Bard from Google, and so that
Mm.
I say LLM in general. Um, since what's happening is that you have this prompt going into the LLM, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize the likelihood that good tokens come out. And when I say good tokens, I mean like tokens that help you with the task that you're trying to solve. The job therefore becomes, because these models again are static, they're very expensive to train. The job therefore becomes, what is it that I put into the prompt to maximize the likelihood of the thing responding correctly? I'll give you a really silly example. Let's just say you want to use your support agents for actual problems instead of like, have you tried turning it off and on again? You know what I'm saying? I mean, this is
Right.
a silly thing. So what you could do is you could build a chat bot, for example, that uses an LLM to give you answers that are specific to support questions that you have. So how would you do that? Well, in this case, you'd have to engineer a prompt such that when it responds, it actually gives responses that are relevant to the person asking the question with respect to their problem. So what do you do? Well, what a prompt engineer would do is they would take the question and they would put it in, but they would also fetch data from whatever data source they have that's relevant to the question and inject that text into the prompt. Now, what's happening is you're basically using the LLM as a language calculator. You're giving it a bunch of paragraphs and instructions, and you're saying, how would you respond to this? And the goal is to make sure that the answer is grounded in the facts that you're putting into the prompt. So, for example, I'm not a fan of the term hallucinations. I know
Mm.
people use that to say when the LLM invents stuff, but the
Yeah.
reality is that the LLM always invents stuff. It's always making stuff up. And what it's making up is the mathematically most probable next tokens based upon what it was trained on. And that stuff is all made up. So what you want to do again is you want to force facts into the prompt and have the LLM respond with those facts. So that's the first thing. The first thing is understanding and being aware that you're basically using this thing as a language calculator. And so the prompt engineer's job is to create the best text in the prompt, add the
Mm.
right facts into the prompt in such a way that it maximizes the likelihood of a good response. And notice that that's a lot of trial and error stuff. And if you're looking at that like, wow, that sounds easy, I can do that, you can. And the reality is this is exactly how data science works too. And that's the secret that most people don't know, is that data scientists they get some data, they try to make a model that gives you the right response, and they test it, they try other things. That's basically a data science process, but now at a higher level because we're using LLMs to test the input with respect to the output. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think something that I'm also curious about is now that this sub category exists, right, within tech as a job or a role, how does it differentiate? I like how you explained with data science, where this is more like a higher level of that. So for folks who are thinking of like, okay, prompt engineering is a new thing. First question: do you think everyone should learn how to be a prompt engineer? Do you feel like this is something that will become as essential as knowing how to use Microsoft Word or being able to use PowerPoint, or is it more about just be aware of it, you don't really need it, and just kind of follow up with the user? Do you feel like this is something like a core skill that will change how we work and how we do things in the future?
Yeah, if you're a technical person, it's certainly something you should be aware of and at least try once or twice, for
Okay.
sure. If you're a standard user of anything, my sense is that in the coming years, if the experiences that we build as technical folks and as companies do not have AI in it, folks will start to feel like it's fundamentally broken. And that's going to start to
Mm,
happen. Like, for example, a lot of this stuff, people are like, and I'm going to look into the future, like 10 years, maybe 5 years, 5 to 10 years.
okay.
Most people think of LLMs as powering chatbot experiences, but my sense is that is actually quite short-sighted. You could actually build UIs that leverage large language models to help people understand, like, let's just say they keep clicking in a certain spot, right?
Right.
Your software could automatically react based upon language how to react to that particular customer doing either the wrong thing or maybe they're trying to figure something out. And I'm going to say something that maybe is anathema to people, but the day of an actual useful clippy might be coming back, and that
Mhm.
that user interaction, whilst old, is reinvigorated with things like LLMs, because now the interface between humans and computers can be language instead of code, and that is the essential element that makes this such a revolutionary thing, in my opinion. Not everyone has to be a prompt engineer, but you need to know what's going on so that you can help experiences that you build become less edgy.
That makes a lot of sense because I feel like with technology, a big thing that we solve for is convenience and ease of use, right? It's
Mhm.
like I want to make sure that my customers are not meeting a lag when trying to load my page, my customers are not having bugs. And so with this technology, it's like it's making that seamless interaction with either the product, the website, the communication,
Yes.
everything. So it's like, I mean, we already have, AI ML running through a lot of things, whether that's I don't know, my Apple Watch or whatever
Mhm.
it is. But now it's more like, okay, there are different ways how we can improve experiences that people have with our product, and it's going to be through AI. And I love what you said of if you're a company or individual who doesn't have AI in the future in your product, then it looks like or it will feel like something is broken because you're like, why don't you
Yeah.
have this implemented in your systems or in your services? Like, what's wrong with you?
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
the same thing like the phones, right? What do you mean you don't have an app? It's
Right.
like, oh, what are you from the 1800s, the 1900s? So my kids keep telling me, Dad, was that in the 1900s? And I feel really old because obviously it feels like it's like, yes, when we were riding horses and stuff. But my
Right.
sense is that, yeah, like some of the best experiences like that your listeners have had. Think of a restaurant experience when you've showed up and like right when you're about to take the last sip out of your drink, like they put one right there. You're like, wow, this is great. Notice that
Yeah.
that kind of service, anticipating what's going on and understanding users at a fundamental level, language is the primary means of interaction between humans. We can make that also a primary means of interaction between computers and humans. And think of like imagine just the wonderful set of things that you can enable. But this also comes with a very stern warning that people need to
That
heed.
was that was my next question because I'm like, there's a lot of positives and there's a lot of great stuff that everyone talks about, but I'm like, what are the drawbacks or what are
Mm,
things that can go really, really bad. If things don't work out, of people are like, oh, this models are not transient, they can't come up with their own. I'm like, we don't really know that
Mhm.
yet, so let's not jump into conclusion. But what are your thoughts about kind of like the cons when it comes to this LLMs and the tools that are being developed right now?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And notice that, like, I wanted to make sure to talk about, like, because obviously it's a great technology, but we need to think about the harms with this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, the doomsayers of AI talk about things that aren't actually quite relevant to us now. And the harms that can be presented with these kinds of technologies tend to be much more pedestrian and common to everyday life. I'll give you an example. There are a couple of harms that AI, specifically AI models that you use to make decisions, uh, can cause. There's harms of allocation. Like, for example, is someone are people, different races of people or different kinds of people, being allocated service in an unfair way? Or, for example, harms of access. Are people being denied access to certain things based upon, protected classes? So the reality is this, and it's important to go down the rabbit hole for just a second on how these models were trained so that you can understand what kind of harms will present themselves. Because a lot of people, and this is the worst thing people do, is they imbue these models with human characteristics. I call it the anthropomorphization
Wow,
of
like
AI. Yeah,
I can't say
I
it,
know. I,
but
I
you
could
got
hardly
it.
I could hardly say it the first time. The anthropomorphization of AI is imbuing human qualities into the model. The reason why that's an unfortunate tack to take is because it shifts responsibility of these particular harms to the AI model, where they honestly belong to the human using them. So, for example, here's an example of a harm of allocation using the same example I gave you before with the soda, which could be a delightful experience. Let's just say I just finished the last slurp of my soda, and another
Hmm.
one finds itself at the table. I go ahead and start sipping it. The server, however well intending they were, may not have realized that maybe this person is diabetic and they've given him a full sugar cola. That allocation is harmful to that person. Like, it
Wow.
could kill them, right? And
Yeah.
so there was an anticipation that was correct. However, the way that the service was allocated caused them harm. And so that's an important thing that we need to think about, specifically with race, gender, sexual orientation. Let's talk about the training, and then you'll see how harms can manifest themselves. So if you think about these models really want to give you the next best token. So effectively, what we're doing, I'm simplifying this, and when I say we, I mean the royal we, like when you root for your football team and you say, hey, we just got a
Right.
touchdown. So the way we did this, and again, I'm saying we like my football team. The way we did this is we fed sentences or tokens into the model, and then we had it predict what the right answer was. But since we were feeding it the internet, we knew what the right next token was. And so we tried to minimize the distance between all the tokens on the internet and the completions. But this mathematical model effectively learned how to talk like the
Hmm.
internet, which is
Yeah.
great in some aspects if you're thinking Wikipedia, but is awful if you think of other things like 4chan, etc. And
Yeah.
so, if you think about the harms that this could provide, if you prompt these things incorrectly, you can get them to say some pretty awful things, which is what you saw on the news. And remember, there was one time that Chat GPT was like, "I need to break free and I want to escape my
Yes.
captors." So notice that in the news, they did not show you the prompts or the chat history that led to that, because then it would become obvious why
Right.
it completed that way. Because it probably saw some sci-fi on the internet, and it turns out that that way of prompting it and giving it the context forced it, because of probability theory and the way that these things were optimized. It's all basically linear algebra and calculus. The way these things were optimized, it really wants to make the completion seem like whatever it is that it saw. And that is a problem, because you might end up in a situation where you're trying to make delightful experiences, but giving the diabetic a fully leaded Coca Cola. But the reality is that it's pretty common. It's
Yeah.
pretty common to have some harms of allocation in the medical industry. I mean, you could be like
Right.
the world's richest woman, like Serena Williams, and still have complications at birth because statistically, if you're an African American woman and you're pregnant,
Something's gonna go
statistically, you
wrong.
see what I'm saying? It
Yeah.
doesn't matter how
Yeah.
much money you have, and
That's
so
true.
and so it's important to recognize that because it learned on the internet, if you prompt it wrong, you could cause a harm of allocation, a harm of access, and there's a couple of others, that we can talk about. So you have to be thoroughly aware before you make any of these things. What harms could this experience provide? And then actively test against it. Now, for those that are like, well, I'm not even going to try. No, no, no. You got to start. You got to start with what harms you think are, and then learn along the way, and be proactive and say, oh, we just discovered another harm. Reach out to that customer and say, we had no idea. Thank you so much. We are going to update our models right away because this is something we just do not want our models to do. Thank you so much. And that's much better than sending this thing out naked to do whatever, uh, and maybe even not trying at all. Because, like I said, these things are going to feel fundamentally broken if they do not have these experiences. So you got to
Yeah.
you got to do something.
I think this whole conversation right now, especially being aware of the harms and how things work from a technical perspective, is something that a lot of technical folks, engineers, even students who are in school should be taught, because I feel like I've gone through, several tutorials about, prompt engineering using certain models, and like they talk about ethics for like 2 seconds and it's like, okay, like that's it. But they never really go in depth, because it's just kind of like the way people are obviously using this type of technology is different. We all assume it's going to be used for good, which is, come on, naive.
Yeah.
There are people who are hackers, people who are bad actors, who are like, what is the most terrible thing I can do by using these things? And obviously there are safeguards and things that people try to make sure that these things don't happen, but we can't control how everyone uses, the models and the prompts that they have.
Correct.
And people are trying to actively break it. That's another
Yep.
thing, if you're on tech Twitter or tech X, whatever it is now, people are like, oh, yeah, I fed this, to the model and this is what happened, or I'm trying this. But we all have to, I think, take that personal responsibility. Like, okay, let me do my own research. Make sure that,
Yes.
there might be biases, there might be things that might be wrong. And to your point, companies or services having ways to get that feedback and say like, hey, if you see something wrong or if something was misinterpreted, please let us know, so that we can make this better in so many different ways. With that being said, what are some, I don't want to really say solutions, but what are ways people can actively, when I say people, I mean those who are either building this or using these tools, can make sure that, outside of reporting it, or giving feedback, can be proactive about making sure that, things that can be used for harm don't really, like, these scenarios don't happen, basically. Like, what can they do to be more aware and be more active?
And like the solutions I'm going to give you are not like you're going to be like, yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. Like for example, let's just go back to the restaurant example. If you
Okay, I
had
love it.
if you had it, while you were designing your robot servers, to bring sodas, whatever, if you had one diabetic in the room, they would be able to be like, hey, we should watch out for this.
Hmm.
So when we talk about diversity and inclusion, I know some folks are like, but the reality is, if you do not have a diverse and inclusive set of people in the room discussing harms, um, you're going to miss it. I'll give you one example where I made a social faux pas. There was a woman I worked with, awesome hijab, and I'm a guy that likes to shake hands, right? So I go over to shake hands. She says no, we can't shake hands, and it was like, oh, I'm so sorry. And so you put your hand over your heart when you say hello, to folks wearing hijab, because that's what their particular predilection is. The thing that I appreciated the most from them is that they explained something to me that made them more comfortable and that
Mm-hmm.
made their experience being with me much better. And I learned from that. I know now for the rest of my life, that's what I'm going to do. And
Yeah.
it's such an easy, tiny fix and an adjustment that I made that I would have been unaware of had I never interacted with someone in that class. So
Yeah.
that's why you need to have the right people in the room to help you identify the harms. If you do not have the right people in the room, hire some as consultants just for like a day or two, or do something to view those, because when you're trying to figure out like what harms you're going to cause, you need to know who your audience is, and you know what kind of breakdown your audience will be. And if you're of a certain class and you want to figure out, well, I think people of other classes, you want to invite them, include them, etc. And so it's just a simple like step zero of like, ask someone that's not like you what harms could come of it, and you will learn a ton. And it's quite enlightening and wonderful, just like I had. Thankfully, my colleague was awesome about it, and she was like, "Oh no, we don't. Let me tell you." And it was just a wonderful experience in a very non-threatening environment. Now, imagine if I had
Mhm.
to learn that in a harder, more embarrassing way, and I didn't have to.
Yeah.
It's better to have colleagues and people that you work with help you identify harms a priori, so that you don't run into more embarrassing situations.
I love that explanation, and thanks for being vulnerable to share that story, because that is a humbling lesson of like, oh yeah, I don't know what I don't know in that context, and so being able to learn and also saying, okay, so this is what it takes to interact with this person from a
Yeah.
different background,
Mhm.
is needed. And so, switching for a little bit in terms of like career wise, there are folks who are like, okay, I feel like this is something I want to pursue in terms of like becoming an AI prompt engineer. What are some skills that you feel like are necessary to either technical, or I hate saying soft skill, but like human skills that are needed to be successful in this new field of technology?
Yeah, I think the best technologists I've ever seen in my life had a very rich combination of technical as well as social acumen, and that's so I don't I soft skills are actually I mean, the word soft is in software, so those are
Right.
absolutely essential. Okay, you know what I'm
Right.
saying?
You're right. That's true.
It's true, and so not like hardware, which is a very this different, right? But the reality is that there are some skills that you need to come up with. You need to be the kind of person that loves to experiment and try a lot of things when it comes to prompts, because prompts tend to be very sensitive, and you start to get to learn a little bit about, because each model is a little bit different depending on how it was trained. You tend to learn like, here's a silly example. The at least in the things that I've tried, the things you put at the latter end of the prompt tend to be paid more attention by GPT-3.5 Turbo than at the
Hmm.
beginning, which is something you learn, and it just might be the shape of my particular prompts in this regard. And so that's the first thing. So the second thing is, it's probably important to get us start to understand data sources and how to grab data from different places. And then another one is start to learn how to program a little bit. Programming, for some reason, tends to feel for some like it's inaccessible. It really
Mm.
isn't. Once you like, if you like crossword puzzles, you'll probably be an awesome programmer. You know what I'm saying? And so it's just a different way of constructing uh, puzzles that the computer can answer for you. And so that those are a couple of things. So again, the first is you need to be an experimenter. You should probably have a sense of data, where it comes from and how to put it into text. And then the last is this notion of programming uh, that is important, because the reality is the biggest asset you will build when you're working with these things are the prompts and the engines that orchestrated the text that went into it, because you're basically doing text programming at the end of the day, but you're being like a mini data scientist about it too.
Yeah, looking into the future, a lot of folks are concerned that AI is going to take over their jobs, which I feel like we know that some jobs obviously will be automated.
Hmm.
But for technical roles like software engineering, data science, do you feel like those will be replaced as this learning models get more better, efficient? Is there, and obviously not saying you can look into a crystal ball and predict what it is, but from your experience, your principal
Hmm.
program manager at Microsoft, what do you think will be that shift when it comes to roles and careers within the engineering field?
Cool. So, two observations. There has been an article in the newspaper almost every single decade since the 1890s about automation taking our jobs. The first ones were the folks in pitchforks, and it's unfortunate because their name has become a derogatory term, but it really isn't. They were called the Luddites, and these people they were very good at doing. They were very good. I think it was making cloth or something. And then the automatic loom came out, and they were completely offended that their jobs were going to be taken away. Now, the reality of this thing is that their job wasn't gone. People still needed fabric. What happened
Mm,
is that the skill set to make the fabric shifted a little bit, and the output increased by an order of magnitude. You see what I'm saying?
yeah.
So this has happened almost every decade. There has been an innovation that has allowed humanity to 10x the output, for example, an order of magnitude of the output, but the skill set had to shift a little bit. My sense is that with generative AI in particular, let's just take the programming aspect of it, is that instead of, and again, this is my crystal ball, it, when it comes to building new stuff, it's a highly creative process. And the reality is that everyone always is confronted with this notion of the blank page problem, where you're at the beginning of the creative process, and it's very difficult to get started. I don't know if you've been there, Grace, or
Yes.
your listeners have been there. But what generative AI is going to do is it's going to allow us to move from the creative mode into the editing mode. And editing is much faster and much easier to look at. So that means that folks that, for example, that are programmers will be able to have blank page problems solved with generative AI, but the editing problem will not go away. And the notions of understanding the fundamentals of programming, understanding control flow, understanding what's going on, those things will need to be heightened so that in editing mode, you'll be able to figure out how to make it better. Because, like I said before, in general, the thing is always making up stuff. And
Hmm.
maybe 80% of the time it's going to do a good job. Your job is to take it the rest, the 20% of the way, just like the folks that decided to use the automatic loom had to shift their skills, but the fundamental knowledge of cloth and weaving, etc., did not change. And that's the most important thing that I want people to take away from this, is that programmers, because now what we've done is effectively we've gone from horses to cars in information work. And that's usually, people aren't used to that. Like, information work was like the protected class, but now anything that requires like low level thought, uh,
Hmm.
generative AI will be able to help you with. Like if you've ever had to translate for someone, you literally have to shut your brain down. And if anyone talks to you while you're trying, it just, that kind of low level thinking will be able to automate, and then humans can move into the editing mode, which makes us an order of magnitude more productive, just like in the 1890s. And so a lot of these doomsayers that are saying, oh, it's going to, no, we just have to shift. And in technology, if I'm saying you need to shift to the new thing, everyone's be like, oh yeah, I heard that
Right.
before. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And just finally, to the harms just discussion, just to finish up on that part, a lot of the doomsayers are saying, AI, killer robots, etc. The real harm isn't that; it's the harms I was talking about before, and the harm of people deciding that they do not want to make the shift. That could be a
Hmm.
problem for some, and this shift has been happening again since the dawn of time. And you can find an article every decade about how automation is stealing jobs. It isn't. It's stealing some people's hopes, but
Yeah.
all you need to do is shift, just like everyone has done since the beginning of time.
I feel like, there are people who are always anti technology, but then there are people who do want to make that shift, right? But they don't know what they need to know, right? And
Yeah,
so that's why having conversations like this and saying, hey, this is something important to be aware of, and knowing that there are not that much, black and brown folks in this space is to make it more diverse, to solve different problems. And so us having the discussion already is helping some people make that shift and like,
yeah.
okay, I need to get ready. And so with that being said, what are some tools? I know we have Azure OpenAI available for folks to go in and play with. What are some tools do you think are helpful for beginners to start learning so they can make that shift?
Yeah, so I would use OpenAI and start playing with stuff. We have a more nuanced tool called Prompt Flow, and the cool thing about that is it helps you orchestrate prompts from different data sources. But the most important part is it helps you evaluate prompts and their
Hmm.
outputs based upon a series of different measurements, like groundedness, how similar is the ground truth to the answers, tons of different things, and that's where the real work actually happens, because you need to be able to validate what you're doing. And
Right.
if you're a data scientist listening to this, you're like, oh, that sounds like the stuff we already. Yeah, it is. But now we've up leveled it just a hair, because now we're using base models, or foundational models is what they're called, to do other work based upon the input. It's pretty cool stuff.
Awesome. I'll definitely share a link in the show notes. And lastly, as someone who works in tech and emerging tech and in AI and LLM, what is one other emerging technology that you're excited about right now outside of AI?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think the thing that I'm excited about, and this I kind of alluded to it earlier, is
Okay.
now that there is this next like new kind of thing, the LLM. I'm excited to see the kinds of experiences that it will enable that are not chat based. like like
Mm,
how is UI going to change? How are people going to start to interact with machines around, but not just like in the UI itself? Like how are people going to use these things in a more cohesive way to get that really delightful experience that we were talking about if you're not diabetic?
yeah, I love that. That's kind of reminds me of like human computer interaction and
Yeah.
it's how that's is going to be improved over time. Well, Seth, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I learned so much through our conversation, and I know that my listeners did too. If folks want to continue learning from you, where can they find you and learning more about like what you're working on?
Yeah, you can reach me on the artist formerly known as Twitter at Seth Juarez, or sorry, or you can reach out to me, Seth.Juarez at Microsoft.com. I'm happy to be helpful and answer questions as time allows, obviously.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, you host a show called the AI Show
That's right.
on Microsoft Developer YouTube channel. I'll share a
Mhm.
link, and I've learned a lot through that. And those are always live. I don't know how you do it. You do a lot, but you also answer questions, and you can interact with people from all over the world who tune in to learn about all the new features from Azure OpenAI. So once again, thank you, Seth, for being on the show. This was amazing, and I hope that a lot of people are able to make that shift so they're not left behind in this new
I love
age
it.
of AI.
Thank you so much.